Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Elizabeth Cummings. I am here with the Newberry Library. Thanks for joining us for today's program, New Directions for Chicago Collections. For those watching from Chicago, I hope you're keeping cool. Today is definitely a hot one. I welcome you today on behalf of the Newberry and the Chicago Collections Consortium, which we're a part of. Chicago Collections is a consortium of libraries and museums and other institutions with archives that collaborate to preserve and share the history of Chicago, of the Chicago region. The work of this collaboration is led by a board of directors drawn from participating institutions, a few of whom you will meet today. And the CCC's work is accomplished with guidance from several standing and advisory committees. One of those is the programming committee that I actually sit on. I imagine many of our viewers today do come from the CCC community, so welcome to all of you. I invite you to visit the CCC's website, chicagocollections.org, to check out the partner organizations and our activities. We hope you will engage with our collections staff and stories that bridge the past and present. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. First off, on the left of our screen is Gregory Yao. He's president of the Center for Research Libraries, where he's responsible for setting strategic directions and determining overall CRL programming and services in collaboration with the board of directors, staff, member libraries, and strategic partners. Before joining the CRL in 2019, he served as the associate director for collections at the MIT libraries. He holds a PhD in US history from Rice University and an MLIS from the University of Pittsburgh. So welcome, Greg. Daniel Green, he is the president and librarian at the Newberry. He joined us in 2019. He's also an adjunct professor of history at Northwestern University. Prior to arriving at the Newberry, Daniel Green curated Americans in the Holocaust, an exhibition that opened in April 2018 at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He earned his PhD in history at the University of Chicago. Danny is the third person on our screen. After that, we have Marsha mcwalker Williams. She's the executive director of the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. We'll shorten that to the BMRC. As executive director, Marsha provides strategic leadership for the consortium's activities and works with BMRC member institutions and the public to facilitate the discovery, preservation, and use of Black historical collections in Chicago. Marsha received a PhD in American history from the University of Chicago and an undergraduate degree in social policy and African American studies from Northwestern. The discussion between these three directors will be moderated by Ellen Keith. Ellen is the 2020 board chair of the Chicago Collections Consortium. Congratulations to her, she just took over, and she's director of research and access and chief librarian at the Chicago History Museum, which she joined in 2012. She's been an active member of the Chicago Collections Consortium since returning to Chicago in 2012, where she served as co-chair of the Cooperative Reference Committee and as a member of the Strategic Planning Task Force. She received her BA in Victorian Studies from Vassar College, as well as an MLIS from Dominican University and an MLA from Johns Hopkins University. So I'm done talking, and I would love to turn it over to Ellen Keith, who's going to take us into our conversation with our directors.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome everyone. We're so glad you've joined us today. I'm going to tell you a few things about this CCC coming up. In 2022, it's our 10th anniversary, so we're very excited. And I just want to note, we started obviously in 2012 with 12 governing members, founding members, and we're up to 51. So just a little shout out there. And I'm so glad our directors have joined us today, and we're going to have a panel discussion, and I'm going to start us off. What's so interesting about the three of you is that you've all joined your institutions fairly recently. And I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about what aspects of their missions attracted you.
Well, maybe I'll just go ahead and jump
Greg.
in. Sure. I'm thrilled to be here in Chicago. I just moved here from from the Boston area, And normally when I talk about CRL, I talk about CRL being this sort of unusual organization. But in the CCC context, I realized that it's not unusual at all. You know, the whole premise of CCC is how can cultural heritage organizations in the Chicago area work above the individual level? How do we work collectively to have more power and scope together, building collections, sharing collections, and building community? And CRL is the same premise, where we happen to be based here in Chicago on the South Side. But CRL is it's a membership organization. It's a research library, but like CCC, it's comprised of 200 research libraries across the U.S. and Canada. And so what I love about CRL is it's everything I love about research libraries, but with that collaboration piece baked in. It's all about what can research libraries do at the network level to project their reach and to make them more successful than what they might be able to do on their own. And so that's why I'm delighted to be here in Chicago at CRL, but also with the Chicago Collections Consortium, which is a consortium that I've admired from afar for some time.
I'll go ahead and jump in after Greg. So like Chicago Collections Consortium, the Black Metropolis Research Consortium is also a membership-based organization. So we are comprised of various libraries, universities, museums, and sort of independent arts and community-based organizations, all who share the goal of basically connecting those who are interested in documenting, sharing, understanding, and preserving Black experiences, specifically with a focus on Chicago and historical collections. For myself, and I think this is true of my other co-panelists, we are all sort of trained historians. And so as a historian, you become familiar with the archive. It's essentially your lifeline in terms of how you're going to conduct your research and what narratives you want to be able to highlight. So for me, specifically the kind of focus on Black historical collections, that sort of aligning with my own work as a historian, really did draw me to the BMRC. In addition, the ability to work with member institutions who are very diverse in terms of the audiences, the constituencies they work with, but also the ways in which they have different strengths, from programming to the collections that they have to being very engaged with the public. So the parts of the BMRC mission that really kind of resonated with me were all of those different areas, from the specific kind of content focus and highlighting Black collections, but also the ways in which you're able to engage with multiple different communities.
Yeah, that really resonates for me too, and why I chose to return to the Newberry about a year ago. The Newberry is an independent research library that's been here in Chicago for over 130 years. We have a fantastic collection of over 1.5 million books and 600,000 historic maps, as well as manuscript pages. And we prioritize access, free and open access. And that's really one of the things that drew me back to the Newberry. You don't need a letter from a dissertation advisor to walk in to see any of this. You just need to be curious. And that's, I think that's such a wonderful thing about the Newberry that drew me back. We also, I think, have this ability to convene communities of learning around a collection, which I find really exciting. Of course, that's one of the things that's been thrown into chaos over the past 4 months, although I'm sure we'll talk about that more. We're finding ways to still convene communities around ideas, even during the pandemic. But the Newberry is a place where new knowledge is generated around these collections based on new research. And I think what we're doing is especially urgent today in all of our organizations and many of the CCC organizations, which is prioritizing telling the truth about history and doing it in a way that's based on evidence. So I think that libraries have a really urgent role, and archives have an urgent role to play in the contemporary culture. And I think there's a power in a group like the Chicago Collections Consortium in bringing us together to be able to do that more effectively.
Yeah, one of our taglines is "We are stronger together," and "Together Chicago." So that resonates with me too, Danny. moving further, let's talk a little bit about your philosophies of leadership and how you've been able to address that in the past 4 months when we've all been sheltering in place and working from home. I know it's been a challenge.
I think we have so much in common that the panelists. As Marcia was saying, we're all historians. I'd love to unpack that. I love that. But we're all new. We're in new leadership roles during an extraordinarily challenging time. Really, just an extraordinarily challenging time. And so leadership and what it means to lead, especially in this context, has been something that's been top of mind for me. I'm sure for all the panelists. And for me, leadership is one. It's about service. It's about doing all you can in service of a mission, beyond yourself, something larger than yourself, and then it's leading a group of people, leading a community, right? So that leading a community so that the community is stronger together in service of that mission. So it's about service, and it's about accountability, right? So it's holding myself when something's not going well or something needs improvement. The first question I ask as a leader, and the last question I leave myself with is, what could I myself be doing to advance, against this problem, this challenge. So in the current environment, I think one of the hard leadership decisions I had to make back in March was when to shut down CRL. And there was a lot of ambiguity, and we weren't sure what was going on, what was the different health, the risk profiles, in Chicago in March. So we gathered up my leadership team, my managers, and we created a whole plan, a phase plan, for escalating, sort of seriousness in terms of shutting down operations related to COVID. And I made the decision to close down the local facility and have everyone work remotely quickly. Maybe about a week ahead of many other organizations. And I was wrestling with that at night, really, really wrestling with it. And I realized that, but for me, as a leader, I'm accountable to the mission, but the mission doesn't exist in the absence of the health and well-being of the staff. And that if I was going to err on the side, of late or early on that, I was going to err on early. So we shut down quickly, and we've been shut down subsequently. We're slowly starting to reopen our operations, but again, erring on the side of caution, and maybe a week or two behind, where other people might be. But that's a conscious decision. So that's my philosophy of leadership: service and accountability. And that shutdown around COVID was one thing that comes to mind when I think about that.
Yeah, I guess my leadership philosophy has always been to try to lead from within and not above, to always kind of see myself as a part of a team, and like Greg said, as a part of the mission. And what's sort of interesting is that when I joined the BMRC in September of 2019, I was a staff of one. And we had been without staff for some time. And so coming in, I didn't really have a team. It was sort of just me. Of course, we have a fabulous board who's been there, but a lot of the kind of day-to-day operations of the organization and getting things running sort of fell on my shoulders. But we've been really fortunate at a time when many institutions are downsizing and freezing. We had some grant funding that allowed us to grow our staff, and we were also able to fill a position that had been vacant. So I actually had the task of trying to lead a team who's never met before in person, who's never actually seen their workspace, and to sort of onboard everyone in the midst of COVID-19, and trying to kind of build that synergy as a team. I think we have sort of been strengthened by this current crisis in this moment. I think it has made all of us willing to sort of step in and do the work and be very clear about what our own sort of strengths are, but also reaching out, when there are things that we don't know. Again, sort of leading from within, not above. I really do prioritize open communication. And so being as open as possible in this moment is important because you're not there face to face to kind of build a rapport and do all of that work. And so being as clear as you can about expectations, being as clear as you can about what you just don't know in this moment, but what you're willing to sort of talk through and think through particular solutions or alternatives. All of that has been really important to kind of building the team that we have now. Our host institution is the University of Chicago. So a lot of our ability to kind of, open up and think about what's possible is sort of related to what's happening with the host institution, but also with the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. Luckily, we've been able to do a lot of our work virtually and remotely, which has been helpful. But it's just interesting to think about, all of our missions being so much about engagement. What does that look like, in a moment where your engagement is pretty much virtual?
I don't want to repeat what Greg and Marcia said, although I feel I share a lot of their sentiments and a lot of the leadership challenges. Onboarding a staff that's never seen their workspace sounds particularly difficult, and that it hasn't met in person. For my first year at the Newberry, I've really prioritized listening. I think it's critically important as a leader to admit what you don't know, and to admit that there are different skill sets and different expertise across the staff, and that we all have a lot to learn from each other, no matter what our positions are. So I've tried to live that out at the Newberry every day, and then on Zoom every day for the past few months. I also think I'm in a somewhat different situation, maybe than Greg and Marcia, leading an organization that's founded in 1887. And has been here in our building since 1893. And I feel the weight of history, maybe as a historian, but I feel the weight of history in this institution. And I want to honor that history, especially that history as a Chicago civic institution, but also find ways to not be afraid of change. The Newberry, especially in this time of social unrest, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need to prioritize that, and that would be that means facing our own history as an organization as well, and not being afraid of change. So that kind of productive tension between honoring the history of the institution and thinking about how we need to change as an institution to be a 21st century institution, I think about constantly in this role.
And Danny, you read my mind. My next question is, would you all talk about how you are addressing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah.
Well, I've gone first the last couple of times. Maybe we should reverse the order. I'll go last this time.
You or me, Marcia? What do you think?
I can go.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so, certainly thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the focus of the BMRC has been on sort of highlighting Black historical collections within our member institutions, as well as trying to diversify the collections management field, the current moment that we're in has really sort of heightened that in some key ways. We do have an Archie Motley archival internship, which provides internship opportunities for students of colors, especially Black students, to gain experience in archives processing throughout our member institutions. And so one of the things that I was really interested in when I came on board with the BMRC was, how do we scale up that program? We're only able to sort of offer a couple of internships each summer, but I was really interested in thinking about, how do we increase that pathway and that pipeline, especially as there's more focus on Black historical collections? How do we ensure that the field itself becomes much more diverse than what it currently is? And so thinking about that area as well. Another area has been our fellowship program we work a lot with, where we bring scholars, artists from all over the country in the world actually, to come do research in our member institutions. Now, that has certainly been complicated by COVID-19, but we still have, a fellowship cohort moving forward. And that has produced all kinds of new narratives about the Black experience in Chicago that we feel is really important to sort of diversifying what we think of when we think about Black people in Chicago. For some people, those narratives might be very narrow, but what we try to do is expand that in key ways, focusing on historical collections and what they can tell us about this city that maybe we had not known of before or hadn't really thought of. One of the things that happened sort of immediately after the murder of George Floyd is I started thinking about the BMRC as an organization. What do we do? What can we do? What can we say? You know, we are not sort of a civil rights organization or a social service organization, you know, in the ways that many others are, but we are an organization that cares about the Black experience in Chicago and, you know, the nation and the world. And so one of the things that we did was we came up with what's called Protests in the Archives, which is a web resource on our website. And essentially what it does is talk about the important ways in which social justice protest has been captured throughout institutions. And we wanted to talk not only about sort of what, how that's been done, what particular strategies, but also the ethics of that. Right? How are you protecting the privacy of protesters, but also documenting this moment so that future historians and scholars can write about it based on sort of primary sources. So it's been interesting trying to find ways to highlight this moment that are compatible with our mission, but that don't kind of step us out into a world that maybe we're not comfortable being in. What we know are Black historical collections. What we know is Chicago. And so how do we highlight that as a strength in this moment to sort of broaden the narrative about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
As far as from the Newberry's perspective, like many cultural institutions, I just want to start by saying, like many cultural institutions, the Newberry has significant work to do in this regard. We need to diversify our staff, we need to diversify our leadership, and we need to continue to invite in researchers and audiences to the library for programs. And in doing so, acknowledge that there are times in the past where the Newberry could have done a better job at that. I do want to say our collections are much more diverse than people realize, or that many people realize. And I think we can do a better job making that known through collaborative partnerships, whether it's collaborative partnerships with the BMRC or the CCC more broadly across Chicago or nationally, and to work in collaborative partnerships to make sure that members of communities that have not always been welcome at the Newberry know that they can learn a lot about their own history at the Newberry. There's two recent projects that I think I'd just like to mention briefly that really speak to where I'd like to see and where I think much of our staff wants to see the Newberry moving. One is a project that we did throughout the year of 2019 called Chicago 1919. And this was a 1919, July of 1919 saw one of the most violent weeks in Chicago history, with race riots across the city, perpetrated by mainly young whites. And we sat at the center of a large collaboration, more than a dozen organizations, looking at the history and the legacy of that violent period in 1919 across Chicago today. And I think one of the best things about this program was that it took place all over the city. So the collaborative partnerships, the programs took place across the city. There was even a bike tour last July that took people to different sites of violence and showed the geography of how the violence spread throughout Chicago. So getting ourselves beyond our walls, I think, is one way to really do important work on diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. We're also, many people listening may know that the Newberry has a particularly strong collection in Native American and Indigenous studies. And we're just embarking on a project right now where we're working with 3 different communities: the Santa Ana Pueblo in New Mexico, the Forest County Potawatomi in Wisconsin, and the Chicago Indigenous community here, the urban Indigenous community here in Chicago, to look at ways that we can, through cataloging and other means of access, be better listeners to Native communities, help and listen to Native communities to learn how cataloging standards, cataloging practices, accessibility of materials can better align with the way that people in those communities would try to find themselves in institutions like the Newberry. So this is a 2-year project that we're really excited about, that we hope can grow over time, where we'll be working in partnership with Native American communities to make sure that our collections are as accessible as possible. So it's those types of programs, Chicago 1919, and this new program that I think our staff is rightfully proud of, and I think it's the direction that we need to be moving as an institution. So I'm happy to see that change happening here.
Yeah, so I was just listening to what Marcia and Danny had to say, and I was just so inspired, and just I want to hear more about some of that work. And look, I'm just going to lay it out there. I'm just going to lay it out there and just say, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, for me, it's everything. It's everything. It's strategy, right down to personnel management. I mean, I think the whole premise of research libraries and cultural heritage institutions is that the more voices that are reflected in our collections, the richer those collections are, and the more voices and stories that are reflected in those collections, the richer the potential knowledge that can be created. And so when you have systems where different voices are silenced or marginalized, we're just not doing our jobs, right? We're not doing our jobs well. And so it really is just, it just needs to be part and parcel of everything we do. And so one of the tensions that I've been navigating is the degree to which we create formal structures to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, versus so right now we've never had a committee, a diversity, and inclusion equity committee at CRL, but I'm really ambivalent about whether or not we do that, because I don't want to give the impression that the diversity, equity, inclusion work happens in that committee, because the fact of the matter is it has to be everything we do. And when I say everything, I mean really everything. I mean, after a meeting, you could pull me aside after that meeting and be like, hey, Greg, in that meeting, how did you advance the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion? So let me be a little bit more specific about how that plays out. So at CRL, it's sort of a wonderful place for me to come in and to bring a really explicit DEI mission, because CRL was created to build collections that were already rare in some way or marginal in some way. The whole premise was we wanted to build, research libraries wanted to build research collections in North America, but some collections, especially international collections, were so expensive to acquire and steward at a local level that we created the center to build global collections, a lot of collections from the global south. And so CRL has a lot of the collections are, by definition, very captures a lot of different diversity voices and stories and experiences. So it's great to be able to build on that mission. I think that at the level of strategy, really, when I think of the strategy of how we're building collections and how we're thinking about collections and how do I build on that tradition, is really thinking about post-colonial frameworks and thinking about collections in post-colonial frameworks, because a lot of the collections we built were built with this sort of extractive model, go around the world and extract the collections out of these different regions. And how do we create a model that's more, as Danny was saying, that's more partnering with different communities, right? In a way that centers their voices and empowers those communities, not this extractive model. We're doing this now. We recently received MacArthur funding to pursue a human rights project with 3 Mexican institutions, and we to document human rights abuses relative to the drug wars. And so we used an explicit post-custodial collections mindset or approach, where CRL is a platform for those 3 institutions in Mexico to work. They're leading the project. They're bringing us in when they want us to be involved, but they're taking lead. So so that's a project very much dedicated to diversity, inclusion, equity, human rights, building on CRL's past experiences with human rights, but being approached with a post-custodial, and I would say post-colonial sort of mindset. That's at the level of big picture strategy. But let me just give another example of how we're advancing DEI, because it's something that would be invisible. This would be invisible labor, but it's right at the level of like every single meeting in the organization. So when we have, if the idea is creating a culture where all voices can be heard and can contribute, one of the tools that we've been using in CRL is that ladder of inference, which is just a really simple but powerful tool for being able to mitigate bias, right? And so we talk a lot about bias mitigation. We talk about bias, implicit bias being just a normal part of human cognition. And so we talk about bias all the time. Where's the bias in this room? How do we minimize bias, right? So really normalizing how we talk about bias, and just regular meetings, regular staff meetings, talk about bias and be open about it, and then use that ladder of inference tool as a way to mitigate bias. But just doing that right at the level of individual meetings is a way for us to advance our DEI values. And I mentioned that because it's not maybe as visible as that MacArthur grant, but really DEI for me, it's everything, right down to every email, every meeting.
This has been fantastic. I could listen to you all so much longer. We do want to leave a little time for Q&A, so I will skip my last question and we'll open it up to our people on Zoom. Feel free to put things in Q&A. Oh, this is wonderful. Here's a great question. Are there ways that your institutions are planning to increase your online presence about which you're excited?
Yes.
Yes.
So, yeah, we have some really exciting things coming out of a grant we received from the Mellon Foundation, which has allowed us to hire 2 additional wonderful people. One of which is our community engagement archivist. The other is our portal archivist. So we're going to be building a legacy management resource portal on the BMRC website, which essentially helps provide information for folks out there who are trying to care for their own personal collections, but also a guide to donating to archives. There can be so much that, if you're not familiar with an archive or how it works, it can seem like this very sort of otherworldly thing. And so what we're wanting to do is kind of democratize that information and that knowledge and put it out there so that people know, if you want to take care of your own materials, here are the things that you want to think about. But also there are these great, wonderful things called archives and archival institutions that can also do that work. So if you're donating, here are some ways in which you can do that. We're also going to be updating our portal of collections on our website and also highlighting our member institutions so that, it is easier to see what each of our member institutions has along Black historical collections. So trying to highlight and increase the visibility of that as well.
Great. I think, if there's a silver, we're all looking for silver linings, right, to the pandemic. And one is that the virtual engagement with the Newberry has skyrocketed. I'm sure this is true for my colleagues' organizations as well, but we've pushed ourselves out of necessity to create a number of new series online. We have a live stream, or we have a live stream Twitter series that we've started called NL from Home, for Newberry Library from Home, where we have a staff member, curator or other librarian or other staff member talk about one item, from the collection in depth for about 10 minutes. And I really like the kind of bite-size ness of that. We found that people have been very, very engaged with that. We've started a Instagram series called Chatting Poetic, where 2 staff members will pick one poem and talk about a poem for a few minutes. And we're finding from audiences that they want to engage with programs at that length sometimes. And I think look, we're all going to be, I think, forever changed by this pandemic. We don't know exactly how. I'd like to think that we will soon be back to a place where we can also gather physically and gather around collections physically. But I think there's a lot we will have learned about virtual engagement, and I think there might be ways where they coexist in a productive tension with each other for institutions like ours. And we're seeing that at the Newberry already. Our hand was forced like so many others, but I think it's really a testament also to just the creativity of the staff at the Newberry, the way that they've stepped up and quickly found ways to keep audiences engaged online.
Well, we just hired a new head of communications, Andrea Dunce. She's only beginning her second month, and Andrea, she loves CRL, but she's let me know in no uncertain terms that we need to remake our entire website. So I think that if Andrea here, she would be able to give a pretty comprehensive answer of changing our digital presence. But in truth, related to the pandemic, we had a significant digital collection that was behind our own paywall. But when we looked at everything that we had behind our own, not a paywall, but behind our limited to members only, we did an assessment of all of the digital content that was not available just on the open web, and we determined that a significant collection would fall under fair use, and so we made that designation. Made, I think, 25,000 pages of really terrific global content open on the open web, because we felt comfortable that fair use would cover that. And we want to continue to push that envelope on fair use to make information as available as open as and available as possible.
We've got another question. Who have been some of your library and research role models, and how did you decide upon your careers?
Well, Marcia mentioned one of mine, Archie Motley, who was the archivist at the Chicago History Museum for so long. And I actually didn't know, Marcia, that there was a internship named after him at the BMRC, but that's really a lovely thing. I mean, the amazing thing about Archie was weeks after you had left the archive, you'd get a letter from him in the mail saying, I found this, I found that, right? And that's I think, so much the spirit of archivists and librarians that I admire, is the way they stay engaged with researchers even after they might have been out of contact with researchers. Those kind of follow-ups, which I've received from other archives, in places where I've done my own archival research for books or exhibitions. It's that spirit that I think is so wonderful. And when I was a graduate student in Chicago, I think that my first encounter like that was with Archie Motley. And so I was so impressed with it.
Yeah, I feel like I need, like, if you have an acceptance speech that you got like all these people to thank, I feel like it's that moment. So it's kind of hard to narrow the list, but I think there have been a few folks in library and archives who've been really essential to me sort of understanding their importance. My journey to doing historical work and research in African-American collections is in large part due to the African-American Studies librarian at Northwestern, Kathleen Bethel. Awesome in terms of opening up the world of research for me. I spent a lot of time as a graduate student at the University of Chicago working on the Mapping the Stacks project under the tutelage of Michael Flug, who was a former archivist with the Chicago Public Library. And then I freely confess to having stalked Lonnie Bunch on many occasions virtually, because I think he's just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I could talk about this for a long time, because there have been so many folks that have helped me along the way, and I've just learned so much from. So, I'm going to give. I'll mention two folks because they've passed away. They're no longer with us, and so I want to. So one was early on in my career when I was a junior archivist in Atlanta. Brenda Banks. Really, I don't know if folks know Brenda Banks, but she was just terrific leader in the archival community, not just in Atlanta, but former president of the of SAA, I didn't know what I was doing, and she took me out for coffee, and she kept on saying that I had potential. I'm not sure I believed her, but she was really generous and wonderful to me. So I have to, mention Brenda. And then at Harvard, I had the chance to work with Dan Hazen, who was he was a longtime curator of Latin American collections in different institutional contexts. But then when at the end of his career, he was the head of collections at Harvard, and I think that he was such an incredible, capacious thinker about collections. He's one of the few folks that could talk about e-resources all the way to incunables. He had such incredible range. It was extraordinary. And so I learned so much from Dan. And I have to always celebrate Dan, because he was I reported to Dan, and we didn't always agree. We had some rocky moments. And so as much as I could celebrate how great he was and how much I think about him and miss him, I always want to take that chance to do that.
I think we've got time for one more if people are willing to hang on for just a few more minutes, because this is a great question for all of you. It's great to see historians so well represented on this panel. I agreed. And how does being a historian impact or inform your work and your current roles in organizations?
Yeah, I feel like maybe I'll let Greg and Marcia answer this. I feel like I spoke to this a bit already in being a Chicagoan myself and working at this this historic Chicago institution. I do feel the weight of history here, right, and a responsibility to the past and the future of this institution as a historian. And then, as I also said, I think we're at a critical moment where we need institutions like this that help people tell the truth about history. There is much too much discourse in our civic culture right now that's not based on evidence or truth. And this is a critical role that libraries and archives have to play. We need to help and enable researchers and audiences that come into the library to understand better how to do that, and to enable that kind of research and discussion that allows them to do that. And we need to be able to do that about our own institutions as well.
Certainly, yeah, I would echo that. I think what made me a better historian was actually understanding archives and how they work, how they come to be, how they are processed, what's the rationale behind that. Made me a much better researcher than if I did not have that knowledge. And so being, head of the BMRC now, I constantly think about that from the perspective of a researcher, and not just someone who's a scholar, but someone who's maybe a lay historian, someone who just has this one question that they want to find the answer to. How can they do that? And so having the kind of knowledge and understanding of what that sort of research life cycle looks like, and all the different folks from various communities who want to know more, I think that really helps me think broadly about the sort of future and direction of the BMRC and how we can be important for many researchers.
Yeah, I love the question. And, I talked about normalizing talking about bias, and so let me just share one of my own. I have an explicit bias for historian. I think it's I just think it's such a wonderful way of generating knowledge, right? And so I think there's a tension between having truth and authority versus diversity, right? Diversity of perspectives and diversity of truths versus authority. And I think historians just do a wonderful job of navigating that space, really, that complexity. I think historians do. I think historians can be challenging to work with, because I think that historians are always trying to make the strange familiar and make the familiar strange, right? But I think that's our great strength. I just love that we can do that. And I think that when, for me as an historian, it's when we look at disruptions in communications, whether it's the book and new forms of media, I think it's very common, with good reason, to think in terms of radical ruptures with the past. And as an historian, reading about the first century of the printing press, for instance, I know that these disruptions are not really we've been here before. And so being able to contextualize some of these changes, however great, in a longer context is something I find it comforting, I suppose, yeah.
That is a great way to conclude. I needed to hear something comforting, so thank you. And so Danny and Greg, we're so grateful to you for being members of CCC. And Marcia, our partnership, the way we complement each other with BMRC is something we really value. So thank you as well. And I will be quiet, and Elizabeth Cummings from the Newberry will take us out. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Just going to share my screen with you all. All right, so thanks to Ellen, Marcia, Greg, and Daniel. I think we had a really lovely and productive discussion today. A recording of this program, just so you all know, will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in a few days. And then make sure to check out the Chicago Collections website to find out more about each of our organizations and how we all work together. There's lots of searchability on there and online exhibitions. It's really a wealth of knowledge. So turning to our next program at the Newberry, I invite you to join us on July 22 for Bug House 2020. This year, Bug House Square, the historic epicenter of speechifying in Chicago, is wherever you are. The event will be hosted by us at the Newberry and co-sponsored by the Society of Smallness, GCE Lab School, and the Washington Square Park Advisory Council. You can register for this and other programs on our website, and you still have a week left to submit a soapbox speech for the event. So check out newberry.org for more info. Thank you all once again, and have a good evening.